by the Honorable Felix Odiwo, alias Jalango. He's a well-known legislator in the country and a media personality. A little history about the Langata cemetery is that, in fact, it's the only cemetery that was set aside since the advent of colonialism for burial rituals. As you know very well, Africans were not burying their dead, and therefore it does not surprise many when we hear that hyenas are feasting on dead bodies, because that was the norm those days. Dead bodies were recipe for hyenas. If you carefully look at the Langata cemetery, it was segregated as it were at that time. There was a section for the Europeans, a section for the Asians, and the Africans were given the far-flung corner where not many bodies were buried anyway those days. And the first to be overused was the European section, because Asians could cremate from time to time, while Europeans were actually burying their dead. Eventually, Africans were brought into the practice of burials, and because they were larger in number, it has now overstripped the size of the land available for those burials. What the Europeans do today, and I have witnessed this, is they reuse their graves, which is common with the European culture, such that if the father died long time ago, followed by the mother and the children, they may all be buried in one grave, just by recouping the soil and burying the dead. The Asians have taken up mostly to cremation, while the Africans now are actually overstretching the piece of land that was available to them, as a result of which there are no procedures, and if there are procedures, they are not well planned. This is why we now have the shallow graves into which you put the bodies, and if you're not careful, two things happen. Hyenas will feast on the dead bodies, where possibly the coffins are not very well done. If you use a very good coffin in Langata cemetery, you got to be careful, because the following day you may find the body of your relative actually outside, because some thief snitched the coffin when you were fast asleep. This is quite common. These are the horror stories we hear from Langata. But what is most important is for the government to relook at the issue of cemeteries, because we do have other towns that are nearby, which possibly have areas and lands which can be set aside for burial places, so that we are able to give our dead people dignified send-off. Kiambu is one of such. Kiambu is one of such towns. I know for sure there was a time there was hue and cry regarding grabbing of the cemetery land in Kiambu, and there is an interesting story told about an MP who defected in the 90s. He was rewarded with a piece of land, which eventually was traced into the cemetery of Kiambu. This is exactly how uncaring we are as regards how we treat dead people, that we can actually give out land set aside for them, as a result of which we all go to Langata to crowd the place, try to bury people in a manner that is not well planned, in a manner that is not dignified, which is totally un-African. As I sum up, we should extend the planning of gravesites into the countryside. There is a bad practice that happens in the countryside where everybody is trying to cement graves, and the consequence is that it's going to be in 50 years' time, you will have no land, no arable land to cultivate, because you filled your entire land with cemented graves. It's not a good practice. It should be discouraged. The county governments, the national governments should now stand up and have good policies, acceptable policies on burials and grave sites. With those remarks, I do support.
Thank you. The next chance will go to member for Lugari, Honorable Nabuera Nabi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.